Hi, I'm Andy, and this is my lesson on regular for loops in Java. In this lesson, I'll show you how to write for loops using a counter variable and how to write them without a counter variable. Let's get started. For loops are a lot like while loops. Their job is to repeat a block of code. The difference is that we generally use while loops when we don't know how many times the loop body will end up executing. We use for loops when we want the loop body to execute a certain number of times. These aren't hard and fast rules. You can write a while loop that does anything a for loop does and vice versa, but it is the convention. And like all programming conventions, you should follow it whenever possible. So here's the program we'll look at. This will be a countdown program. It will ask the user to enter a number, and then it'll count down from that number at 1 second intervals. I've already added the code that asks for the countdown time and stores it in a variable called num seconds. Now what we want to do is print the numbers from num seconds down to 1. For example, if the user enters 3, we want this to print on the screen with a 1 second time interval between numbers. Notice the repetition implied here. We print a number, pause for a second, print a number, pause for a second, and so on. That means we should use a loop. Since the number of repetitions is fixed after the user enters num seconds, we'll want to use a for loop rather than a while loop. First, we need to make a variable called num to print. Num to print will be the number we will print to the console. And the first number we want to print is whatever the user entered for num seconds. Now we can make our for loop. To do that, we type for, and then we put parentheses. Inside these parentheses, we put 3 sections of code separated by semicolons. I'll put the semicolons first just so I don't forget them. In this first section, right here, we put our initialization statement. This is a small line of code that executes just once when the program first begins executing this for loop. In this section, we typically want to declare a variable and initialize it to a starting value. I'll make a variable called I and initialize it to 0. I is going to serve as a counter. Its only purpose is to ensure we repeat the for loop's block of code the correct number of times. We're initializing our counter to 0 because computer programs typically start counting at 0, not at 1. In the second section, we're going to put a Boolean expression that determines when the for loop stops. Specifically, the for loop will execute only when this Boolean expression is true. The number of times we want the for loop to execute is equal to num seconds. For example, if num seconds is 3, we want the for loop to execute 3 times so it can print 3, 2, and 1. During this time, our counter will count 0, 1, 2, and our loop will need to stop once I equals 3. That means we want to execute our loop while I is less than num seconds. In this third section, we put a short line of code that we want to execute after each time through the loop body. Since I is a counter, in order to count, it needs to be incremented by 1 after the loop body executes. Okay, let's move on to our loop body. Just like with a while loop, we need to think about what code needs to be repeated in this program. The first thing we need to repeat is a print line of num to print, like this. We then need to decrease num to print so that each time through this block of code, a smaller number is printed. Also, we need to pause for a second after each number is printed. Here's the code that does that. Don't worry about exactly how this works. It has some advanced stuff in it like try and catch that you don't need to bother with at this point. All you need to know is that this parameter here in the sleep method is the number of milliseconds the program pauses for. So I put 1,000 there because 1,000 milliseconds is 1 second. So that's the last line of code that needs to repeat in our for loop. Let's add the last line of code after the for loop and then run it a couple of times. Okay, so everything works. Now let's analyze this for loop more closely by walking through exactly what happened when I entered 3 for num seconds. This line of code initialized num to print to 3. Then the program hits the for loop. This initialization statement creates the variable I and stores 0 in it. Then this expression evaluates. At this point, I is 0 and num seconds is 3. So this expression is true. And because it's true, the loop body will now execute. So first, num to print is printed on the screen. Then num to print is reduced by 1. This line of code then pauses the program for 1 second. After the for loop's code finishes, this statement executes, increasing I by 1. Then this expression evaluates again. It's still true, so the loop body will execute again. Then this statement executes again, increasing I to 2. Now this expression evaluates again. It's still true, so the loop body will execute once again. And then this statement increases I to 3. Now this expression evaluates yet again. This time it evaluates to false. That means the for loop is done. Its body will be skipped over, and the program executes whatever code comes after its closing curly brace. So that's how a for loop operates. Be sure you understand the order in which various parts are executed. Before we go, let's revisit our for loop and see if we can write it a different way. Our current for loop makes use of a counter I. Let's see if we can write the for loop without a counter. Instead of using a counter, let's initialize num to print at the start of our for loop. We want this for loop to execute as long as num to print is greater than 0. And after each time through the loop, we want num to print to reduce by 1. Because num to print will reduce at the end of each time through the for loop's body, we don't need this code right here. Let's test out this version and make sure our program still works. I actually prefer this second version of our for loop. It's a bit more concise because it doesn't use an additional counter variable. That being said, there's nothing wrong with using the counter version of the for loop. It worked well and was not difficult to understand. By the way, don't worry if at this point you find for loops a bit intimidating. They can be confusing when you first see them because they have so much going on in the parentheses. They're certainly much more complicated than while loops. But you'll see that writing good for loops becomes second nature after a while. With practice, they really do become quite easy. And that wraps up this lesson on for loops in Java. I'm Andy. Thanks for watching and coding with me today.